Kia ora tātou, ko Waimatati awa, ko Mekaroli Timoana, ko Stromboli Timonga, ko Patrick McHugh take noa. And I'm talking to you this afternoon about future plans with psychedelics. We'll touch very briefly on some wellbeing innovations that Tūranga Health, along with Mātai, are looking at progressing. So as background, I work as community liaison with Mātai, helping to link Mātai with the community and develop some relationships. Also have a role with Tūranga Health around primary care, integrated care, which gets me out of bed in the morning. And I also have a role with what was the DHB now, Te Whatu Ora Tarawhiti, working part-time in the emergency department and also supervising GP trainees when we've got some GP trainees to supervise. And also work with the opiate treatment service, with the addiction service side of things. So coming back to psychedelics, so some of you may have read the book by Michael Pollan on how to change your mind. There's also an interesting Netflix docu-series about that as well too. But psychedelics seem to be making more and more splash in the news. But coming back and giving a brief history around psychedelics. So back in the 1940s, Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist, synthesized LSD and accidentally had a taste of the LSD. He then had the first Western psychedelic experience with LSD anyway. And then researchers asked the question, can LSD provide a model for exploring psychotic illnesses? And that led on to some other research around depression, anxiety states, post-traumatic stress disorder, and also addictions, where LSD and subsequently other psychedelics have been found to be very helpful from a therapeutic point of view as far as that's concerned. Just comment at this stage as well, the therapeutic effect relates to how it's embedded within a whole therapeutic process with some work before, during, and after the psychedelic experience. So by no means am I advocating for the recreational use of psychedelics. It's important they're conceived within a therapeutic context. And on that note, there was some research back in the 50s and 60s, and some of those researchers, their belief was that the psychedelics, particularly LSD, are too good an experience to keep within the research setting. And so they promulgated the use outside the research component in society with Woodstock, hippies, and what have you. And actually led to some issues where young people especially, who had an experience of psychedelics were much less likely to stick their hand up and volunteer and go to meaningless wars like in Vietnam or do what the government at the time there in America wanted them to do. And so, many ways that led to the government deciding that we can't have the youth not being as obedient as what we'd like them to be. And so that then led to a propaganda and war on drugs being escalated, as there was already a war on drugs regarding cannabis and other drugs, but then the psychedelics were added to that, and so psychedelics were categorized as a Class A drug, and a lot of the research was then abandoned, and any work with that was driven underground. Just also acknowledging that whilst LSD was the Western pathway to exploring a psychedelic experience, that psychedelic compounds have been known for hundreds of years by different communities and different cultures. So in South America, they've been using ayahuasca. In Africa, ibogaine. There's also mescaline, which is the active component in cacti such as peyote and San Pedro, and also psilocin, which is the active metabolite of psilocybin, found in over 200 mushrooms, commonly known as magic mushrooms, around the world. So coming back to the local scene, this is a picture here of Rangiwahu Marae. So probably about 2 or 3 years ago, I had a conversation with Manu Kaddi, which led to other conversations with some of the whānau of Rangiwahu Marae, with Jody Tororo and Kay Robin in particular. And then Manu is very influential and managed to get some scientists from ESR and Manaki Whenua. And they came to one of the wānanga there at Rangiwahu Marae and went for a forage and managed to find some psychedelically active mushrooms. They've since collected them and taken them back to their laboratory with the view of being able to study and explore them further, and particularly being able to how they can be cultivated with the view of then being able to use them therapeutically subsequently. There's also been a fair bit of work done in terms of putting an application into HRC, and so we were successful in getting a fund of $300,000 from HRC, with that being to fund a collaborative investigation for the therapeutic potential of naturally active psychoactive taonga species fungi, and then to develop tikanga Māori approaches for treatment of addiction and potentially other mental health conditions in a marae setting by, with, and for Māori. So that's a work in progress. There's There's also some further funding from TPK, which was to look at the legal and regulatory framework around psychedelics. So there's been a series of ongoing wānanga out there at Rangiwaha Marae, which is, for those of you who aren't aware, it's just south of Muriwai, around what, as a boy growing up, I called the Bartlett's area, but it's about 20 k's south of Gisborne. And so at that, with the wānanga we've had there, and some of the publicity, some of it word of mouth, some of it underground, there's been various expertise and experiential, first-hand experiences coming forward to proffer their experiences with psychedelics, as there's a number of healers working elsewhere in the country and around this rohi who've been using psychedelics underground, off the radar for some time for therapeutic processes. And so leveraging off that experience and also talking through how we want to do it here in Tairāwhiti, part of it has been developing our own tikanga and kawa going forwards, and also looking at how we can develop the ability to be able to cultivate and grow some of these psychedelic active mushrooms locally to be able to use it therapeutically in the future. So on that note, Rua Bioscience just last month were granted the first license here in Aotearoa to actually cultivate indigenous fungi. And so they got a license for exploring up to 9 to 10 of the indigenous mushroom and just seeing which is going to be easier to cultivate, and also looking at subsequently being able to analyze how much psilocybin they contain and how stable that is, so that ultimately we can look at using the whole mushroom and being able to be reasonably confident of the content of the active component within that mushroom. And so we're looking at a clinical trial. So a fair bit of work's been done for that, and we're on track for running that in the middle of next year. And with that, we're looking at having 12 healthy volunteers having a dose of psilocybin. It's going to take a bit longer to get to the stage we can actually use the whole mushroom, but the intent is to be able to use the whole mushroom at some stage in the near future. But at this stage, looking at using psilocybin, which we'll be importing from Canada, where it's isolated from the whole mushroom, and then they sort of take the whole mushroom and be able to obtain the psilocybin from that whole mushroom. They're also using that psilocybin in Australia, and so some of you may be aware that Australia has recently been permitted to allow psychiatrists to prescribe psilocybin and or MDMA, which is another name for what the youth would know as ecstasy, but being able to use that in a controlled environment for certain circumstances. I did mention briefly before about set and setting, so that's key in terms of how someone experiences their psychedelic trip, their experience. And so a lot of that is around setting the expectations beforehand and also some work during and after. So beforehand, part of it is looking at some work with the individual or the whānau to let them know what the mushroom may be doing for them, the medicine, so they know what to expect. Also part of it is setting their intent, and so we're not looking at recreational use, so part of it is how it's used therapeutically, as most of us will have some sort of emotional baggage, and so the way I understand it, it's an opportunity to actually address some of that emotional baggage when we have the experience and work with that. Also beforehand, they're equipped with some safety tools, some self-awareness around mindfulness, around breathing, and being able just to keep themselves safe and navigate their way through that. During the experience, they're accompanied by in the order of 2 guides, and so for our trial, we're looking at using a kaitiaki, one of the local whānau from the Rangiwaha Marae, who have been through some training with the Maori Order, whānau order framework, and also a clinician who's had some experience with managing psychedelic experiences and guiding people through that. And as I mentioned before about the emotional baggage, that with it, the way I understand it, if someone is approaching the psychedelic experience from the point of view of dealing with some of that emotional baggage, that not infrequently during that experience, they can have some inner demons come up. And if they back away from the inner demons, those inner demons can potentially sort of chase after them and make it even a scarier experience. Whereas if they face up the inner demons, have some breathing and sort of welcome the experience, those demons will tend to disperse and become a pleasant and a healing experience for the individual. Also, there needs to be work after the psychedelic experience, looking at how they integrate the learnings from that. So they're not looking at using any substances to recreate that experience necessarily downstream, but how they can get the full value out of that experience. Also, I mentioned about some wellness wellbeing approaches, so involved that with Tūronga Health. So Tūronga Health have been, for the last year or two, been looking at developing a community centre there in Elgin, and that's in response to the community voice. So there had been some surveying of the Elgin community a few years ago with E2 Elgin, and the expression had come up that they wanted and needed a community centre. So in response to that, Tūronga Health have established a community centre there with a cafe, which used to be McLean's Pharmacy, is now Manawaru, a cafe. And what used to be Sirinyani Kara's GP rooms there years ago, that's now had the bulldozer put through it, and a new building's been put up looking at developing services around the community voice that can respond to their wants and needs. It's also going to be strengths-based, so in many ways what we pay attention to grows stronger. So we focus on disease or the illness that gives the disease or illness more mana. Whereas we focus on what's well, the strengths, and trying to build on the strengths, then that helps improve the strengths. So it's a strengths-based approach. There'll be a strong focus on food, on kai, as in many ways food brings people together and is integral to our health. So we are what we eat at more ways than one. And so there's some work going around some group-based interventions with Kainuku, which is a whole food, plant-strong approach. Also offering a low-carb, healthy fat approach, as also has been some other research which has shown that the low-carb, healthy fat approach can be useful for things like diabetes. But part of it has been able to give the whānau choice as to where they want to go and be able to equip them with options, and also looking at exploring how we can support the marakai, the home veggie gardens. As growing up as a lad, most homes had a veggie garden in their backyard, whereas now they've disappeared. If someone's renting, it's very hard to actually put a veggie garden in because the landlords, by and large, don't like the veggie garden going in because it'll be nurtured and maintained for a period, but after that it tends to get dilapidated. And so it's much easier to maintain lawn than a veggie garden in the long term. So it's very hard for someone who's renting or leasing a house to be actually put in their own marakai. Also, just in closing, around making some comments around climate change. So I think all of us here in Tairāwhiti are very aware around the climate change and how that's affecting us, with a number of emergency states being announced over the last year or two, and how the weather is becoming increasingly at front of mind rather than back of mind. So I'd suggest that in some ways Tairāwhiti is the canary in the coal mine as far as New Zealand is concerned. There's also growing urgency from the scientific community, both nationally and globally, around looking at how it can fund some research from a health perspective. As I was at a workshop at Hui just on Tuesday, where the HRC is looking at committing in the order of $5 million to the New Zealand scientific community to research around climate change, wellness, wellbeing approaches. So just in closing, I'd like to say, ka ora te whenua, ka ora te tangata. When the land is well, the people are well. Kia ora.